My name's Liam Smith. I'm the Director of Behavioural Australia, and I'm the host, I guess, of today's webinar series. It's one in a series called Challenge Accepted, and it's about using behavioural science to really deal with complex issues and challenges. Uh, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we come to at this webinar today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation, at the eastern part of Melbourne. And I'd like to acknowledge that the land was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present. For those of you just joining, you probably noticed a pop-up, or you will notice one shortly, a pop-up saying that this seminar series is being recorded. So if you can accept that or acknowledge that, that would be fantastic. We will make this video available to all attendees, of course, and then probably on social and other media into the future so that others can watch back. I'm really excited for today's webinar. It's a really exciting part of this series, the third part. Those of you who attended the previous ones, the first one was around doing behaviour change inside complex systems and how we might go about it. The second one was around how we can potentially use behavioural science to understand systems and potentially drive systemic change. And today's webinar series is about how we use behavioural science inside organisations. Perhaps just a little bit first about Behavioural Australia. We're a large university-based applied behaviour research centre. We've been founded, we were founded nearly 15 years ago, and we've done it's probably more like 700 projects since then. And essentially we work on the premise that human behaviour underpins a lot of the greatest challenges that we have, particularly those that we see in the Sustainable Development Goals, but they also represent a place where we can focus for trying to solve or improve outcomes related to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're very lucky today to have three great speakers. I'll introduce each one as they go. But just a couple of other housekeeping things before we get started. Many of you will see or should see a Q&A box. Please feel free to use that as the speakers are speaking. When you do so, if you could say who your question to ask questions, if you can say who your question is directed at, that would be really helpful, because particularly if you think of a question that comes for our first speaker near the end, it is good for him to know that that question is still for him. What the speakers will do after speaking is essentially try and respond to those questions while the other speakers are speaking. And at the end, for our last speaker, Connor, I will jump in and try and mediate some of those Q&A questions at the end, which directly, I guess, with Connor. So today's webinar, it's about using behavioural science inside organisations. We're going to see three different presentations around how we can do that. And I'll pretty quickly hand over to our very first speaker, that is Michael Daddo. Michael Daddo is a long-standing collaborator of Behavioural. In fact, he was there when Behavioural was born. Shannon Company at the time, now Shannon Behaviour Change, was a founding partner of Behavioural, and Michael has been collaborating with us for nearly 15 years. We're really lucky to have Michael on our team, and really privileged, I guess, to hear him present today about the work that the Shannon Behaviour Change do in understanding organisations' positions and crafting narratives for change. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Michael for his initial presentation. Michael.
Great, thanks Liam. I hope everyone can see the slides. So I'll jump straight in. I won't spend too much time on myself because that looks a bit embarrassing, but I haven't changed too much, in case you can't see me. Bald head just does that to you. Keeps you nice and young forever. My job is running the Shannon Company, but leading the strategic and creative application of behavioural science. And in the last 15 years with Liam and team has been fundamental to the way we approach driving change for organisations. As it says at the top there, we do this for governments, have done for numerous governments over the journey. We do it for a multitude of organisations, Probably some of our biggest ones at a social level have been the industry super funds movement and what we've been able to achieve with the superannuation program in Australia, which is now the 4th largest in the world. Unions, and then more recently, we've also done political campaigns, and political campaigns obviously use narratives, which I'm going to talk to you about. And narratives at times can be a dirty word, but in this case, we talk about the change narrative and what we use to fundamentally drive change, both at a society, but importantly in context of today, organisational change. There is obviously some models and processes I'll share with you, but I want to share this quote first from Joan Didion, who obviously the great American writer and thinker, I would argue. And it's important in the context of this is because it's something historically we've always told ourselves stories and the way we pass knowledge and wisdom on to generations that underpin how and values and how we want to live and work and behave generally. For me, it's a bit sort of also not just in order to live, but how we live, why we live, and the way in which we choose to live. So for me, this sort of quote is a great backdrop to the art of the narrative. And it is an art in many ways, because there is the science that underpins it, but is it a creative expression of an argument that it changes the way we believe about something now to a future way of belief, which underpins a desired behaviour. I'll reference a number of these organisations as we go through, just as I've talked through the models to give some examples. But so you know the scale of the organisations we've been dealing with in using the change narrative. ICSOM is Australia's largest chemical organisation, in fact the Asia Pacific's in New Zealand and Australia and in America now and in Asia with around water in particular. Chemicals are interesting. Chemicals are a dirty word, but what we wanted to do was build pride inside the organisation about bringing a number of acquisitions together globally around the way they allow us to live better. All our water is treated by chemicals, and it makes it the best in Melbourne, particularly, I would argue, the best water in the world. So ICSOM's one of its great clients is Melbourne Water, who I know we'll talk a bit later on. Bupa we've worked through Asia Pacific with on 3 narratives now. One in particular about aligning the idea of the planet's health with individual health, importantly for them internally. Ampol about the forecourt moving from just fossil fuel to electric energy charging, and about that change and ramifications for the organisation in that process. And that was particularly for the CEO, so he could deal with the press. An important concept in that, which I'll talk more about, is the idea is you've got to own that you're part of the problem sometimes to arrive at the new desired location. I'll spend a fair bit of time on Rio Tinto, who we've done 2 narratives with, and we're in the process of working with them again on a 3rd process about change, but particularly around safety at workplace, particularly around mental well-being, dealing with harassment, sexual abuse, and racism, which has been one of the big issues out of the Royal Commissions that they had in Western Australia. WorkSafe, we did some work a long time ago when we first introduced the brand WorkSafe to Victoria, and the power of its change program internally about giving people the vision held by one in a short-term narrative, in a short context of the narrative. The most important reason to believe to be safe at work is not at work at all. And that whole transformation of the organisation made it incredibly powerful. And a little aside on that, it became so powerful that when a government tried to change the name back to the Victorian Work Cover Prevention Authority, the staff basically revolted and wouldn't allow it to happen. They bought 3 years worth of clothing with WorkSafe branding on it. So that's how strong a powerful idea within a narrative can do. The other one is St Vincent's Health Australia, which is the largest microcosm of the health system in the country, has private and public hospitals in Victoria and New South Wales and in Queensland also. We worked with them about bringing their 30,000 staff together around one key thought, basically highlighting the spirit of the 5 sisters who founded it 100 years ago. So these are programs I'll talk to in the way they work. So they're working at scale, they're working with big organisations. And in the case of Rio and Bupa, there's multiple narratives at play around specific issues and within specific parts of the organisation. We call it a change narrative for the very important reason is that we're all facing change. All organisations are facing change and how you move an organisation through change becomes paramount to its success. And for us, the change narrative not only aligns people, but it moves people from one set of beliefs about an issue, about the organisation, to a new set of beliefs to underpin a desired behaviour. And at the heart of it, it's a substantial truth. It's not, if you're a marketer, about brand essence or brand pieces. This is a substantial argument that has both the emotional and rational reasons to believe why we should be behaving in a different way. So for us, it's a really important thing. Narratives get a bad rap because politicians do it, and that's, we started this in 1996 with the Steve Brack's election, and we have adapted our process of doing that as we've got more involved with behavioural science to understand the power that it has, that science can bring to our creative and strategic approach to the work. There is that classic story or phrase that if you don't tell your story in the way you want, someone else will tell it their way. And this is the danger we have with all sorts of change and programs, particularly within organisations. If it hits a roadblock or it hits areas where people disagree, their voice becomes louder and louder. So we want to control the narrative. We want the narrative to be owned, embraced across the organisation and through the organisation. And that's very important in the way we've designed our process in developing the narratives to ensure buy-in for everybody. The narrative, when we use it, change narrative, takes us on what the way we describe a behavioural journey, if you like, is first about sensitising in the context of an organisation to that change that we want them to do. So there's a number of ways the narrative can be used very early on to communicate the scale of change and why that change is needed. So the elaboration of why we need to change becomes really important. And then we move to the stages of the enable and behave part of the process, but the narrative needs to hold all the messaging throughout each of these stages. So sensitising why this change is important right now. So for Rio, it was prior to the WA Royal Commission, but there was issues and they've been well documented. And I know Denise will talk a bit more about this from BHP's point of view, but on sites around the country, indeed around the world, in mine sites, racism, sexism, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and violence. So we wanted to get to the idea that this was a bigger issue. It wasn't just happening in very small parts. It was an issue for not only for society, which is society's dealing with it, but it's a site on mines. And then we start to elaborate on why it's important for their personal well-being and their safety, and then start to build the capability. How are we going to help them behave the way we want them to behave? So it shapes the context in which change will happen, which is fundamental, and it provides the moral arguments for the acceptance of interventions. And those interventions can be about the way an organisation runs, the rules, the reward systems. It can be about the acceptance in the mining sites, about better lighting, no alcohol involved at sites, etc. So there's lots of different interventions that will be played out to ensure the behaviour happens. But the idea of the narrative is that it holds the context and helps provide that moral argument for those changes to happen, and then hopefully moves into the habitual behaviour that we want from people. So the narrative we've developed over, as I said, 30 years ago in a political sense, follows a very, very distinct and set construct. And it's done in a way that first empathises with everybody, shows an understanding of why this matters to all of us. So even during the Millennium Drought, we talked about why this mattered for all Victorians and Melburnians in particular. For Rio, it was about why this is important to them and on each site and each location and each shift. And this was an understanding that it's a societal issue, that it then rolls into the individual issue. We do acknowledge the scale of it, how big it is. We own our mistakes, as I said, with Ampol. We own that we are part of the fossil fuel world, but we are going to move to the new renewable energy and electric forecourt. We take our position as leaders, or whatever that process is about it, as the protagonists to that antagonism of the issue, and that we state our ambition. That obviously aligns with an organisation's vision, values, purpose, and the way they're trying to embrace change internally. And then we take control of the situation. This is where we start to outline what we're going to do as an organisation and the interventions and the programs we're going to introduce to address the issue or underpin the change that we want to have happen. And then we talk about the benefits, so tie it back to the emotional benefit, right back in a circular loop to why is important to all of us. And that obviously includes this, what we like to call a call to arms, that everybody needs to get involved in the process. And I'll talk a little bit about the idea of a cadre shortly. So as I said, the change narrative and the way we've designed it and the process and the way we use it is based from two disciplines. One was a political narrative, political in the sense of true political terms, in terms of getting elected leader in place and getting all his ministers lined up around one narrative when he took control, but also using academic behavioural science techniques throughout the narrative, which is why we call it the change narrative. And it becomes both a definitive piece by which to judge the actions of individuals in the organisation. It's the basis for everyone to tell the same story, no matter what level they're at. So whether it's the CEO who's the chief storyteller, which McKinsey would talk about, or whether it's the cadre, the person in the team for us who is not the appointed leader of the team. It's the sort of, if I use the expression, the person you most want to go and have a beer with or a cup of coffee with, the person who influences at the base level of an organisation. So when we talked with Rio, we talked at the mine level all the way down that site. So in fact, I probably skipped a slide there, did I? I might just get back one just to explain the Rio example there. So in the Rio process, just to show that the example here was around the speeches that we use it for, the social media that we use it for, the internal EDMs and the emails to the staff, etc., through the process. PR where it was required, and particularly in response with Rio off the back of the Royal Commission and what all the miners were doing. We wanted to have a clear shape in the way we want to talk there. The stakeholder programs, so the government became an important stakeholder, the unions are important in that program. Each of the local communities in which we work so this went through works in 10 countries. It had translations to different languages in those countries. So each of those programs was important. And then it played very heavily to the internal culture program that was running through the change of their behaviours and their values and their vision for the organisation. It built into the training interventions that were introduced to underpin the idea of it. In fact, the narrative was produced in 2 film versions, in different short versions of it, and was played at both the starting of their online training programs and as you finish the program as well. There's 2 versions of it to top and tail the training. And then also played to the recruiting because they had particular quota objectives for bringing women into the workforce and onto the mines and the sites, which obviously if there's lots of news and poor news about sexual harassment and violence, and Denise has got some figures and publicity about that for BHP, but all the mines were covering that area. So attracting talent to the organisation and to the industry per se was very important. So our narrative held all those communication pieces together for it. And then importantly, it said why that was important for us at that, if I follow that process, the empathising with it was about the physical and the psychological safety, acknowledgement that it was not just an issue at one location, it was a global issue. So they'd done a 10,000 survey across 50,000 survey across 10 countries to do. It was the biggest global corporate program of its kind to survey the issue and around sexual harassment, violence and racism. So it was about making sure that everyone understood it was a company-wide issue, not just at a certain mine, not just at mines, it was also at head office, etc. So that was very important to acknowledge the scale of it, that we were dealing with addressing both social and organisational change. I think I've just got a rev up from speed-wise. The process was important, and the process is fundamental. So we do a lot of desktop research, obviously with the vision, the purpose and the values of the organisation, whatever the company is, whether it's a 3, 5, 10-year strategy, or indeed we use the narrative process during COVID with Australian Super on a quarterly basis. We look at any research, both internal research and external research, and obviously what the brand is standing for. So all that desktop research, which you would expect to do. What we do design, which is very important in our process, is about interviews with customers, stakeholders, the board, the CEO. That's obviously very important as the chief storyteller, the executive, business leads, all the appointed leads. But what is really important is this idea of cadres. And why we do the interviews through this across the organisation and down the organisation is this important bit about insight and buy-in. So we get insight about the strategy and how we've got to do the barriers and all those things, but we also get buy-in to it. So the idea that people, when they're involved in something, in organisational change or any program, when they start to design it and do it, they get emotional buy-in to the program. That leads to their participation in it, and it helps drive the positive behaviour. So the cadres become really important in that process, and it was quite different because they become one of the key storytellers for us. So we talk about the narrative is not only in the construct what's important, but who tells that story, whether it's the CEO as the chief storyteller or the cadre at the peer storyteller level. So the one inside a team who's not the appointed team leader, but the person you might want to go and have a coffee or a drink with. So the narrative holds all that program in messaging construct, from big speeches down to, in case of elections, 5-second little posts. That's my time and wind up. So I'll hand over now to Denise, who's got a very cool picture of herself.
Back to me first, Michael, but thank you very much. And I'll just do the segue across into Denise. Really interesting to hear about the importance of narratives and the change narrative, and how that can sensitize, I guess, an organisation to get ready for change and to accept interventions. I think that's, and importantly, really interesting to hear how you develop those narratives. Our next speaker is Denise Goodwin. Denise is the director of Behavioural Health and Social portfolio. She has been a member of Behavioural for just under 10 years. I think she's just about to get long service leave, and she's going to talk about some of her experiences inside organisations. So I'll hand over to you, Denise. Denise, you're muted.
Thanks, Liam. And it's a really good segue actually from what Michael was saying. So I know Alison, I'm sure Michael will respond to your question in the chat, but when you asked about the why, often we do work with Shannon Behaviour Change for this exact purpose, because we see the narrative very much as some of our intervention of how then that gives us license to go into other things. But I'll show how I'll weave that in, and how we've done that in the past as part of this presentation. So, behavioural science and change management, we seem to be doing much more in this space, and be it by design or just by chance. It's an area that we're getting asked more and more to sort of think about how behavioural science can really support it. And behavioural science, it offers valuable insights for change management in organisations, pretty much by helping leaders in many ways understand and influence employee behaviour during transitions, but maybe even more importantly, how these insights can inform the transitions and associated interventions that support that process. So even before you're starting the change management, how can behavioural insights or those types of the information, the why, as we've just said there, understanding that better can actually support interventions that then support change management. So by applying principles from behavioural science, organisations can create, we think, more effective change management strategies that really foster that buy-in from employees, help to minimise resistance to the change, and drive sustainable adoption of new processes or systems that are being introduced. As part of this process, it's key that we really understand the challenge. So we spend a lot of time, as we've said, the why, the challenge, why is change management, what does success look like, and then how can we actually then pull that apart. From that, we actually really focus in usually on the associated drives and barriers that can influence the transition across the organisation. What we have found, and it's not unusual, is there can often be a disconnect between the leadership and sort of the high up expectations of what change should look like, and also the frontline beliefs and what they believe about the type of change we're bringing in, which can really, really hamper that change management. And as Michael really alluded to, a level of resistance that can come from that from employees. So trying to navigate that, we've seen has been really important, and somewhere where behavioural science adds an extra lens on top of the other disciplines that actually support this process. So we at Behavioural, we've completed a number of projects across various sectors, from healthcare to government and private industry. Today, I am going to highlight the benefit of the sort of behavioural insights through a piece of research that we did carry out with BHP, a large mining, but in particular, a large mining site in Western Australia, where they were looking to implement, a significant change management, which links to a lot of what Michael was saying just momentarily, a moment ago. So some of the change management is often in response to systemic issues. In this instance, there were increasing reports of sexual harassment, there was bullying, some highly publicised instances of rape in the industry, and on the site that we were then subsequently working on, so they'd had some significant instances or alleged instances that had happened. That obviously it's not good for business, but also it's not good for everyone working in that space. And they were, had targets where they were trying to bring more women in particular into the mining sector. So in the Australian mining industry at the moment, there was pretty low female participation rates. When we were doing the work, it was around 22% overall. But the gender-based harassment rates that were reported were around 62% for women. So more than 1 in 2 women were reporting that they were dealing with some sort of harassment within their work, which was a whole range of things. And for men, that was 25%. So actually, still a lot, 1 in 4, that's still a lot of people who are reporting pretty poor behaviours and things happening within that industry. So for us, the question is really around how do organisations then best address systemic issues as part of their corporate responsibility, but also in their change management. Now, gender in the workplace, that was seen as one of the ways that we could potentially overcome some of these issues. More women on the site, there was potential opportunities. Also, it's good for business. There has been so many documented studies that say if we get this right, there's having that gender balance can actually be really, really good for a multitude of reasons. But, worldwide examinations on this have shown there has been significant resistance to it. So in 2016, on the site we were working on, there's about 18% representation of women, and not across the whole mine either. So that's really important, as we're looking at representation across, most of the workforce and everything like that, not just a lot of people that sit in an office. So when people do say, oh, we've got good representation of women, my next question usually is, no matter what the industry is, where do they sit? Have we got it across the workforce? Because actually we probably want gender diversity or diversity overall to be represented throughout where we are. But women do remain underrepresented in the mining industry, a disparity that contributes to challenges such as sexual discrimination and harassment. And while also presenting opportunities to address this imbalance through initiatives such as gender targets, our study in particular explored the implementation of gender targets at the mine. And we were really looking to that, they were looking to increase the proportion of women in its workforce at the time. We were really interested in examining employees' perceptions of the intended and unintended consequences of these targets. So we really wanted to know, the targets have been put in place. We know they were having some challenges and some backlash to the targets that are coming in place. We wanted to really know the why, and if we'd actually presented the wrong why, and how future interventions could actually support the process that was going on, and also support those women who had taken up employment at the mine to make them feel safe and wanting to continue in that employment. So we were really focused on, I guess, the translation of the gender targets into the organisational practices and the mechanisms that can enhance the acceptance and implementation of such initiatives. while actually mitigating potential backlash or resistance among existing employees. That's probably one of the things that we're really still interested in, is that resistance and backlash, and how we can better navigate that through the interventions that get put in place, rather than try and mitigate it afterwards. So we were fortunate enough to spend time on site, living the FIFO life. Obviously, I didn't do this alone. There's a whole team of us that were involved in this research. By living that FIFO life and, you know, traveling up, you really got an insight into some of the unique challenges employees faced in this industry. And even before any type of change management is introduced, the kind of conditions and things that they were already dealing with as employees, and the type of shifts on, 12-hour shifts, a lot of travel. It's quite an intense environment, with a whole host of things going on, which really plays in then to how people react to changes within their workplace. So we worked in, this was up in the Pilbara in WA. It's a remote Australian mine. There are about 1,000 employees, and it's pure fly in, fly out. There's no one really driving into work there. So everyone comes in on the plane on one day, and then everyone goes out depending on your shift. It's quite interesting. It was a new mine. So it had an opportunity to look at a number of initiatives, and it did have a number of initiatives. It did a lot of environmental changes and things like that as part of the programme. But even with all of these things going in terms of creating better places where people could socialise, reducing alcohol, reducing the size of the shift patterns and things like that, even with all of these, they were still experiencing a large backlash or resistance to these gender targets. So by 2025, so the time has come and gone, they wanted basically to get around 40 to 50% of women. Now, these are targets, they're not quotas. So the difference here is that the target is something that they've set themselves. It's not a mandated quota. So, you know, as long as they were near enough hitting that and everything, that's okay. It's not something like on boards, for example, where we're actually mandating what's required. But beyond the targets, they also review shift patterns, as I say, and everything else to know why not. They currently were, or at the time, became known as the most gender balanced mine in the world. So they were doing a pretty good job of keeping people in, also bringing people in. But, you know, reducing some of the noise, I guess, was some of the important things. So the findings from this research, it highlighted how gender targets influence perceptions of inclusion, competence and fairness for both men and women at the mine. There were some positive reflections. I won't go through these quotes individually. I'll let you read these here. But there were some benefits that people were talking about, and it was around people bringing new perspectives, new ways of actually doing things, and that safety element. So there was both psychological and physical safety benefits that were highlighted as part of this process. There were some people that were saying that those were negative consequences, but overall, actually safety and the benefit of safety came through. So that why I'm focusing on something like safety is something that we would take forward in future pieces of work. Now, obviously being academics, we want to also bring in and analyze our data according to, you know, what's known and everything else. And Dover and colleagues present a framework to address why diversity initiatives often fall short of creating fairer, more inclusive and more diverse workplaces. And they talk about signals communicated by organisational diversity initiatives that may match what leaders have intended, or they may become disconnected. So regardless of whether initiatives align with leadership intention, they may have consequences that are not intended, not fully appreciated. In this instance, we were definitely seeing unintended consequences as a result of bringing it in. The assumption was if we tell people that having gender diversity is great on the mine, that people would just accept it. The reality was very, very different. And we're, again, seeing that play out, not just within the workplace, but within society at large at the moment. So we were definitely on a day-to-day basis while we were up there witnessing this at the mine. The diversity of the initiatives, namely the gender targets, were creating other consequences that had not been foreseen by the leadership, and it was really affecting employees notably and differently. So what we were seeing here, for example, with fairness, is that underrepresented groups, the idea is that they were being treated fairly and that they decreased sensitivity to unfairness. Well, we weren't actually seeing that. We knew that, for example, there was a lot of women who'd gone into leadership positions who were still going to the narrative of saying, oh, I only got this job because I'm a woman. It's like, well, no, you got this job because you're a good manager, and actually you're really good at your job, and you bring a different viewpoint that is pushing the staff and everything on board. So they were starting to take on some of those things. And obviously the overrepresented groups, so in this instance, it's predominantly white men, that they were being treated unfairly. That was the kind of fairness signal that they got. So they were really had this increased sensitivity to discrimination of advantaged groups. I'm not going to fully go through this framework today because it does go into a lot of depth, but I wanted to just highlight that we really dive into other parts of the literature and then give an example. So I'll go on the unintended consequences of inclusion with some of the time I've got left. Now, for inclusion, there was a strong perception of threat and victimization by some men. So they did see gender targets as something, hang on, but that influences me. And we were hearing that a lot, as the quote says there. And I said, you carry on about everyone's inclusive and it's all this, but it's not. I said, as a white heterosexual male, I'm the most victimized person on site. Now, this is a common narrative that we do hear, and we hear it perpetuated quite a lot. And something that actually, how do we actually navigate that? So speaking to Michael's point and everything else around change narratives, how can we use those types of tools to actually navigate where we are now that we know these pieces of information are very, very clear? The other one for inclusion, no longer to act authentically. So if we can't have our banter, I'll quit and I'll work in the oil industry where you can still talk in the way we like to talk. Really interesting one again. How do you actually take that piece of information and then develop interventions or things that means that we're not actually directly saying, no, you can't think like that. We need to give people authenticity and realize that they can have that space to have those thoughts or conclusions, but actually help to guide them through that. Actually, times have changed and we are doing things differently. Now, there were some additional findings, a lot around rationalization, as I said, physical safety, conflation. It was a new site. They were blaming a lot of things that went wrong on women. So there's a lot of other things that we were navigating there, and as well as rejection and intersectionality. So when we talk about gender, actually, there's a whole lot of other things going on. Just to finish up, and we do have information on our website around this particular project if you would like to learn more, but the so what really is, what does this mean for change management and associated interventions that are designed to change behaviour? Now, I've put a bit of a provocative comment in the slide here, but there is some reality in what is being referred to. With the current challenge, often we see that education can be seen as one of the main interventions or information given. If we tell people this is a good thing to do, they will likely just change their attitudes and the behaviours accordingly. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. And from our research on the mine, we did not see a shift in behaviours from just having this alone, which suggests that other behaviour change interventions are really important. If we know what the barriers are, so the research that we've actually done, then engaging with the types of interventions that are likely to increase the odds of behaviour change is what we would advise. And we work very closely then with our partners to actually design some of these, of which the change narrative was a part of this, this process. This may not always include education, but different ways of using persuasion. For example, like I say, a compelling change narrative that acknowledges the challenges and enhances the audience, coupled with other interventions, is really key. In this instance, just to finish off, leadership was an area where there were opportunities. So we still needed to work with leaders. They weren't all on the same page, really supporting the business objectives here. There also were skills on training on listening and also how to manage those dominant voices that were opposed to change. So what we observed is people needed to be heard with activities that enable honest but moderated conversations that provided a good first step, and interventions that really, again, use some of them behavioural science insights to try and increase the odds of bringing people along on that journey. I will finish there and pass on to back to Liam.
Thanks, Denise. Fascinating insights from being inside and on-site the organisation. It shows that behavioural observation and the power of that can show some disconnect, which is so important. Our last speaker today is Connor Wynne. Connor is a former PhD student at Behavioural Australia, finished about a couple of years ago. now works in a project management governance role. But we regularly invite Connor to be part of the tent, and we include him very much as a friend, and in fact he's a former affiliate of Behavioural. And he's going to talk about some of the work he did during his PhD, which really lent into this idea of resistance. I see there's a question there about that, and so hopefully Connor can shed a bit of light on that. So over to you, Connor. I'll let you share your slides and present.
Thanks, Liam. Okay, hoping you can all see this. Are we good? Mm. Can we see this? Yeah.
Yeah,
all right.
All working.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Liam. So my work with Liam was the culmination of about a 15-year journey. I'd started off doing sociology because I'd worked around people in power for a long time and found that I found many instances of what looked to be irrational behavior. And so I needed to understand why people in power behave the way they did. It wasn't something I really had much choice about. I had to really understand it. And so I found Behavioural and Liam and did a PhD part-time, which took 8 years in itself. And that resulted in 3 papers. And what I'm going to do is talk about one of those papers today, which is based on an engineering-based company, which went through some significant change, and culture was a barrier, and they needed to change culture in order to be effective. And so I'll pick through the lessons of that case study, and there's a link to the case study in plain English at the back of this deck. So I'm going to talk about 3 main points. A theme for me, largely, I've spent a lot of time thinking about power and resistance. Narrative is part of that, and let me explain. So the postmodernists would say that essentially that life is meaningless, and we create stories to give it meaning. The constructionists would say that it's people in power who do that. I'm more of a pragmatist, but what I'm really interested in is seeing where there is power and resistance in situ in the same place, and that's what happened in this organization. And so what we'll see is that culture that gets in the way of performance is a real problem. And by reality, I mean a reality that one of the telltale signs of reality is it doesn't care about your opinion. It pushes back on what you think. And so you can try and create a narrative, but if it's not real and the issue isn't real, it'll push back, and that narrative can be sidelined. Also, what I'll talk about is how targeting beliefs directly is good, but it's not enough. You need power to change the context, and so behavior. And so you see the little diagram on the right-hand side, and that's not meant to be mechanistic, but essentially what I'm saying is context influences beliefs, which then influence behavior. And so my argument based on this research was to say, look at changing context so that you send signals or behavioral cues that impact on people's beliefs and therefore changes behavior. And so let me talk a little bit about culture. So in this situation, what you had was an integrated, a stable environment. It was an engineering-based business that was facing a strategic crisis, and the internal values of the organization, which was that it was conservative, hierarchical, and bureaucratic, they fitted a stable environment. Typically, their decisions around investing lasted 20 to 30 years. So there was a very long lead time between cause and effect. And so they were very cautious. What happened was that there was a shift in the external environment. There was a business problem. They needed to increase the amount of work that they did, or capital expenditure, 6-fold, practically overnight, in response to this strategic change. And so what happened was you had the existing culture was stranded. No longer was a conservative, hierarchical, bureaucratic organization going to work in that situation. And what made it real was that this crisis was on the front page of the Herald Sun. The politicians were campaigning about it. People knew about it at barbecues. It was obvious to everybody that this was a real problem that needed to be dealt with quickly. And so there was real power that came from the shift in external environment. There was also real recognition on the part of the owners of this organization that the culture was going to get in the way. And so you had before we embarked on the culture change, you had effectively the conditions for success, which was genuine power from an external environment, recognition that the internal environment just didn't match up with the external environment. And so there was a need for culture change. And so what happened, as we'll see throughout this, is that culture was realigned so that it fitted the new environment. There was a change of behaviors so that the engineers were more innovative, more responsive, and more pragmatic. So the second point I want to talk about was that targeting beliefs directly is good, but not good enough. And one of the reasons for that is that we're rarely aware of what influences us. So this is Edgar Schein's model of culture. It's much more nuanced than just the way things are done around here. Schein talks about aspects of culture which are visible and those which aren't. What's visible? Artifacts and observed behaviors. So by that I mean, do people have reserved car park spots? Does somebody have an EA? All of that stuff they're cues which are obvious and which we can see. Beliefs, values, and goals, they can also be seen around the place. Posters, working arrangements, they can be observed. But what drives a lot of us or what we do most of the time is what we do most of the time, which is one of those things is habit. And so we're often not conscious of those habits. They're great for navigating complexity of life, but we're often not aware of them. And there is, of course, the unconscious, which most of us aren't aware of, why we behave the way we do. And so for a direct communication to influence this is extremely ambitious in the least. So for instance, if you talk about unconscious motivators, there was a study done of the effect of parenting styles on children in Japan versus the US. Children in Japan, when they cried, were tended to be left and ignored more often than those in the US. And so for somebody brought up in Japan or someone brought up in the US, they won't be aware of what has influenced them when they were in the cot, when they were literally days or weeks old. And so there are lots of unconscious motivations that we're not aware of. And so to ask communications or direct communications to influence that is a very big ask. And secondly, behavior change is really complex. And so this is a simplified version of the theory of planned behavior, which we use in this study, which talks about norms, which is what we think important people expect of us, and also how we see people behave. And there's a conflict between those, it's not do as I do, it's do as I say, which is an issue. Attitudes, which is how we feel about something, or how good or bad we think it will be for us if we behave that way. And then there's behavioral control, which is the extent to which we think something will be easy or difficult, and also then our skills and our ability to be able to carry out those behaviors. And so that's a part of behavior which in really good models can give you up to about 50% in terms of being able to predict behavior. But influencing that are a whole series of things that are very difficult to get very difficult to be precise about, such as the personality of the people involved in the group. That's you can get about a 25 or 30% value in terms of predictive capability out of personality alone. The use of indirect power, so in other words, changing context so that you change behavior. Foucault is famous for saying that power is structuring the field of possibilities for others. In other words, you're not necessarily talking to people directly. You're setting up boundaries within which people behave. And then there's punishment and reward. Both clear signals as to what works and what doesn't work in a setting. So this is a complex picture, and to expect comms or a traditional change program to attract this is very ambitious. And so my final point is that in order for what this case study is saying is that for behavior to change, one needs power to change context. And so what happened here was, in this organization, they made 4 changes to context. They started measuring culture, particularly around engineers' attitude towards innovation and creativity, a speak-up culture, and that was driven through by the leadership team. There was alliance contracting. In other words, they bought in effectively, commercially, fresh blood and fresh eyes around how to do the engineering. There was co-location of those engineers, so that the silos which had previously existed were broken down. People were literally moved out of their offices and they were sat beside people that they need to work with, and the boundaries were policed. And by that I mean the boundaries of acceptable behavior in a kind of Foucauldian sense. Like if you didn't behave the way you were supposed to, you were punished. And in one instance, it involved a full-on power struggle between those who had been in charge before, led largely by the engineering department, who had a particular way of looking at standards, and the new management. And literally, in a number of instances, those people who fought too hard and pushed back too hard were asked to leave the organization. That had a massive influence on other people who were looking to resist. And then so beliefs were being changed. So one of the beliefs was you're being watched, and that's again, so it's something Foucault would say is important, that the gaze is even being watched in itself is a strong signal to change. People were then encouraged to challenge and innovate. The no more silos was affected by co-location. And the fact that people were asked to leave the organization said that there was punishment. This seems quite dark, but the effect was there was a 6-fold increase in capital expenditure, and programs were delivered on time and on budget. And the organization was seen to be much more effective than it was before. And so this was a positive use of power for good. Power often has a negative consequence, seen as Machiavellian and dark and nasty, but it's effectively a tool, and to create change, one needs to harness power. What went through the minds of those subject to power? What happened was context changed around them. They thought, how should I behave in the context of being watched and being encouraged to challenge and innovate? They also thought about how they felt about it and whether it was worth it. In the case of those who resisted, some who resisted effectively were the ones who resisted too hard were asked to leave the organization. The ones who resisted over a long period of time suffered. They suffered as a result of having to bear the pressure of changing their beliefs, and they ended up compromising. And the effect of that on the rest of the organization was that it sent clear signals as to how to behave. And I saw this through the lens of this is a simplified version of the behavior works method, which is, well, if you wanted to do this, how would you do it? Does it just define, design, deliver? You start with a problem, look at the existing culture and look at desired culture. That gives you a gap. You need to link that to context to see what is the undeniable narrative that exists that makes this not contestable. If it's contestable, you enter into the situation of power and resistance, and so it's debatable as to whether somebody's going to work. If it's linked strongly to the organization's effectiveness within context, then you've got a chance. Then you need to look at structural levers, and in other words, what is it that you change in context so that it's going to link directly to behavior. And that then gives you which is where comms people take over, largely, which is a change blueprint and implementation and adoption. I think, pretty sure that's me, Liam.
Thanks, Connor. Really appreciate that. Really interesting. There is a question there for you if you were able to quickly have a look at that. I'm conscious we're nearly out of time, so we probably need to move just to wrap up. But interesting to hear about your work, and particularly understanding more about the resistance, and you can learn a lot more about this paper here, from this paper here. Connor, I might just get you to stay on your slides and just skip through. Oh, sorry, it's too late. If you could just pop them back and we'll jump through to the next one. So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions for Connor. We've really pushed it to the end. I have just, Connor, I hope you don't mind, put your email into the chat if anyone has any further questions to follow through with you.
Good.
As I said, we will make these available. If you can skip to the next slide, Connor, that'd be great. And perhaps the next one after that. This is the third of the fourth series. There is a fourth series, fourth coming up. The QR code is down the bottom. The last session will be really about how to go about embedding behavioural science knowledge into organisations. Behaviours has done a lot of training and understanding about where capabilities are at, ranging from helping organisations just not make mistakes or implement some fairly basic tools, right through to becoming genuine research partners and testing and trialing new things. And we'll talk a little bit about that through some next in the next webinar, which is called Insider Knowledge, Embedding Behaviour Insights Capacity in your organisation. So look forward to seeing a few of you there. Do feel free to get in touch with anything else any other questions that we have here, and look out for a recording of this webinar in the near future. Thanks for coming, and thanks again to our three speakers, Michael, Denise and Connor. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.